Today's NPA speaker is Raymond, who's an experimental physicist at Berkeley Lab and UC Berkeley. He's a member of the JetScape collaboration and also the ALICE collaboration, where he co-leads the JET working group. And today he's going to talk about probing QCD matter.
Thank you. It's very nice to be back here. Since there are so many familiar faces here, I wrote this talk initially thinking maybe the older NPA seminar is a little wider audience, so I will speed through the introduction here, and then we can talk about some physics. So when I've been presenting this recently, I think it's nice to kind of break down our particular steps here. And
can I interrupt you and pause you?
I mean,
much as I like looking at you, can we move?
Oh, yeah. The point of the talk is just to look at
You're great, but you're not.
How about this? Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay. And okay, my comment on this, I mean, I prepared a bunch of things, but we don't need to get through all of it today. Please interrupt me, ask questions. I'd like to have a nice discussion. So, okay, I think we all know this, so I'll go very quick, but right, the idea here, right, we're talking about QCD, quantum chromodynamics, right? We're talking about the field theory of the strong nuclear force. I have some nice graphics borrowed from Laura here, right, to remind us that we're really looking into the inside of the structure, inside of our proton, at our quarks and gluons. And in particular, right, QCD is particularly interesting, amongst other reasons, because our gluons are force carriers, right? They carry color charge, which leads to this complex set of self-interactions. And so if one thinks about kind of what the consequences are, right, if you take two kind of fundamental particles as interacting, right, we have to define our scale of our interaction, right? So we have our coupling, and we can talk about the momentum transfer between our particles, right? We have our small and large q squared. But a particular point, right, is that due to quantum mechanics, as we kind of probe this at our different scales, right, we start to have our evolutions evolve, and we have our virtual pairs screening our interaction, right, which leads to some dependence of our q squared on our coupling, right? So we really have this rather dynamic environment, which we can see if we look at a function of our strength of our coupling. Alpha S is a function of our momentum transfer q, right? And we can kind of divide this into our two regions. One on the left, right, at low q squared, we have this kind of highly nonlinear environment where we're confined inside of our hadrons, right? We go to high q squared, we get this kind of relatively simple environment, at least kind of the very high energy limit, where you have this predominantly 2-to-2 scattering, right? And this concept of asymptotic freedom. So again, hopefully all very familiar. We've got QCD kind of marked off, right? But we want to talk about QCD matter, right? Some ensemble of particles, right? And it's really just a broad principle of physics, right? When we have some ensemble of particles, right, we're going to have some sort of complex emergent behavior that's not directly derivable from our elementary interactions, right? We can put up our phase diagram of water, where we're predominantly dominated by electricity and magnetism, right? And we can have our QCD phase diagram sketch. Right, so the point is to try and understand what these emergent dynamics look like, right? And we can do this through our lattice QCD exercises, right? We take our QCD, we do a calculation on some particular lattice to make it a little bit more calculable, right? With the right calculational approach, right? We know that this is quite effective, at least in particular limits, right? Okay, but I particularly want to bring up lattice QCD because it really gives us at least some insight for what these dynamics should look like, right? So here I have this energy density normalized kind of appropriately by the temperature to be proportional to degrees of freedom, right? And what we see here is right, our predicted transition around 155 MeV, where we're moving from our, I guess I can point with this, from confinement to deconfinement, right? We're moving from our hadronic to our partonic degrees of freedom, right, through this region here. But I want to also notice as we go to very high temperatures, right, there's still some particular gap between our kind of non-interacting Stefan-Boltzmann limit and where we expect to these expectations for our partonic degrees of freedom, right, which is really telling us that we have some sort of complex bound states of quarks and gluons, which we'll frequently think about as the quark-gluon plasma. So we have our cosmological view of this, right, early universe, But in terms of how we actually access this, right, is through our collider approach. Both RHIC and LHC, right, gives the opportunity to collide these highly Lorentz contracted nuclei at very high energies, and gives the opportunity to really probe the dynamics of these interactions. Right. So right, we frequently treat these in terms of our different sets of stages in our interactions. So we have our initial state on the left, and as we move through this, right, the bulk medium evolves according to hydrodynamics, more or less. Right, we have some interactions of high momentum transfer probes, which we'll particularly focus on today. Right, that then eventually hadronize out into particles that we'll detect in our detectors. Okay, we've got Rick and LHC. Congratulations to Rick for completing quite a successful, like 26 years of running last week, right? We have our least detector. As I said, I'm just going to run through this very quickly. We should all know this, right? We've got our beams, we've got our people for scale. Yeah, there you go. And we've got our very nice event displays. All right, we've blown through both QCD and matter in 6 minutes flat. All right, let's move on to our microscopic structure. I promise there is some very nice physics here, but I don't want to take too much of our time on these things that I think most folks are familiar with. So, right, if we actually want to probe our microscopic structure, how do we go about doing this? Right, we can draw this nice analogy to, revealing the internal structure of humans, right, through a computed tomography approach. I've been saying CT scans, but in fact, PET scans, I think, are a better example in terms of self-generated probe, right? Something that gives you an ability to actually look inside based on your source. And in fact, right, jets in vacuum, right, this tool that we've already seen in this kind of high Q squared limit, in fact, gives us exactly a calibrated probe to do the same sort of exercise in heavy ion collisions. So we're going to put our jets inside of our collisions, right, self-generated as a rare interaction, and use this as a hopefully at least controlled probe to study the quark-gluon plasma, right? Connecting to my previous diagram as well. Skip through that. So okay, now we can get to a little bit of our physics, right? What do we actually expect in terms of experimental expectations of these interactions from our momentum transfer interactions, or our partons, right? We expect that our jets are produced relatively early in collision from our nuclei interacting, surrounded by many soft interactions from our nucleons interacting, surrounded by many soft interactions from other partons, right? And collectively, the full set of interactions between our jet and the medium, right? This is what we refer to as jet quenching. And by doing this, right, again, we have this high momentum transfer probe. High momentum transfer translates to short length scales, right, which gives us the opportunity to actually try and access some details of what the microscopic structure of the QGP is, as opposed to just its bulk dynamics. Now, to be a little bit precise about kind of the expectations, right, we know that we expect energy redistribution in these interactions, right? So I have energy, for example, flowing to large angles compared to my jet axis. Right, we know broadly that there's modification of our internal jet structure, right? So energy is getting redistributed within our jet. And then we also can talk about jet deflection, right? So some sort of interaction between some sort of scattering center in our medium that can lead to a full change in the direction of our jets. And we'll think particularly about this one on the right. Okay, and then we of course know very well, right, when you're actually finding jets in our experiment, right, this is quite a challenge experimentally, right? If I take my cartoon on the left and try and connect it to an example event display from Atlas on the right, my leading jet's very clearly seen, my subleading jet less so, right? There are different experimental background techniques to remove this. I'm not going to talk about them today, but in fact, there have been many developments in this group to try and address these. All right, we've did run our introduction here. Let's move on to some actual physics. Right, the concept that I want to talk about today is an experiment or a measurement that I've done in Elise, right, focusing on this concept of jet deflection, right? So by drawing analogy to Rutherford scattering, right, using these very nice diagrams from Katie, right, The idea is I want to use some calibrated beam to look for structure inside of my sample. Right, in Rutherford, it was a gold foil, but right, the question is, can we do the same sort of experiment inside the quark-gluon plasma? So to think a little bit about what our expectations should be for what this looks like, we can plot kind of some arbitrary probability distribution for expectations for interactions between a probe as a function of kT, so the transverse momentum that I pick up as my part-time interacts with the medium. So in terms of kind of the overall broadening signal, you expect something Gaussian-like, right? That will eventually die off as you go to high kT, right? And as you go to particularly high values, the expectation is that you're going to see something that looks like a different, more power law-like distribution, right? Frequently described as Mollier scattering, single hard scattering, some sort of scattering off of some sort of scattering center in your medium. I'm not going to be too precise about what that is. Right, and so this expectation at least leads us to kind of two possible approaches for how to look for these type of effects. So one is via this so-called jet deflection approach. So I look for some dijet pair, and I look for a deflection in one of those versus in my expectations compared to my baseline. And another is to look inside of my jet to try and look for subjet deflection. So some sort of again, interaction with the scattering center. It won't be at, let's say, wide angles like the Rutherford scattering would be, but conceptually the idea is still the same. So to say one slide in terms of our expectations for jet deflection, right? This has been a search that's been ongoing for some time, right? So I find, in this case, my trigger hadron, and I look for the angular distribution of my recoil jet. Again, comparing lead to PP. And I show you two panels here in the middle at very low PT and on the right at high PT. So starting at this kind of higher PT region, okay, within our experimental uncertainties, we see roughly consistent behavior as a function of R. Now, as a reminder, right, if I'm looking for jet deflection for the overall jet, my expectation is that I shouldn't have any dependence on my jet R, right? As long as I find a jet, right, which I should, right, if it's deflected or not, right, there should be kind of no particular dependence on the resolution parameter. But as we see, if we go to the middle, we're going to lower PT, and suddenly we see this very strong R-dependent trend, right? We're seeing the yield increase as you go to the larger R. And what this is telling us, right, is that in fact, it's showing us some rather different behavior than what we might expect from kind of a Mollier scattering, large angle scattering. Instead, what this is telling us is kind of filling proportional to our jet. And so if you think about this for a while, right, there's something that gives you behavior like this, which is exactly medium response, right? Filling up kind of the area that you have available. And so it seems, at least in this jet deflection approach, we're more sensitive to other effects rather than kind of Mollier type scattering. So, okay, this is very interesting, right? An opportunity to try and isolate the impacts of medium response is certainly something that we want to try and investigate further. But in terms of thinking about searching for this scattering center approach, right, this jet deflection doesn't seem to be a direction we can go to access this. So let's take a look at the subjet deflection approach. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, that slide didn't get fixed. Well, okay. In any case, let's ignore this in the middle. Apologies. Anyway, the concept is I'm now going to take my jet shower, right? So a few slides back, I had this jet propagating interacting through the medium. I just rotated this and focused on one of my particular jets. And I'm going to look into the structure in detail and try and isolate particular splittings where I see a systematic increase in my KT here, right? So the concept is, again, I'm looking for some sort of interaction, some sort of scattering center that systematically, on a statistical basis at least, the naive expectation is that this should give us some enhancement at these particularly large KT splittings in lead. So we've done the work to look for this set of splittings. So again, to be very explicit, the expectation here, I've normalized out kind of the overall energy loss dependence. So it's just a ratio focusing on kind of the relative changes in my distribution. And the expectation here is that if you have kind of just this simple picture, you should see some enhancement at high KT from some sort of quasi-particle scattering. So we can look at this in a few different ways. So one is using this so-called soft drop grooming algorithm, right? So looking for sufficiently hard momentum sharing between my subjects. And what we see, right, is in fact this kind of overall suppression at a high KT, with some different comparisons to models, which I'll get to in a moment, but see kind of this overall narrowing effect, which should be fairly familiar from kind of other substructure measurements, at least for inclusive substructure measurements. So, but part of the study also was trying to look at the difference between different grooming algorithms, so different approaches for selecting these underlying splittings. And so we also employed this so-called dynamical grooming approach, which has a scale that you can kind of dynamically set to focus on particular characteristics of splitting. So in this particular case, we used A of 1, which focuses on the highest KT. So I look through my entire iterative splittings within my jet, and I look for these high KT splittings and select preferentially the first one or the highest one of those, as opposed to just the first one that I get from soft drop. So experimentally, this approach is, I think, well motivated. However, it turns out that experimentally, this is really problematic to actually measure. So in particular, because we don't have a minimum scale cutoff, right? You do, as you do with soft drop, you have your Z cut of 0.1 or 0.2, right? This means that I can have, for example, a jet that's fully dominated by soft splittings that doesn't enter my soft drop, right? This enters as untagged in my soft drop case, but for dynamical grooming, we have to deal with trying to unfold this. And it turns out that in doing so, this basically fully kind of contaminates the soft half of your KT distribution. And in practice, basically, we're kind of constrained by what we can unfold in terms of our kind of balance between our kinematic efficiencies and actually having kind of a closing unfolding. All of that, you know, to say that and to summarize that, this approach is interesting in that it gives you the opportunity to try to tailor your grooming algorithm, but in practice, this trades a high susceptibility to background contributions that makes it very difficult to experimentally measure. Okay, so fine. Bottom line, though, is that it at least gives us a consistent cross-check compared to our soft drop, even if the uncertainties are less constraining.
The R equals 0.2, is that like for your full jet or for the subjets?
It's for the full jet. So in these kinematics, right, 68 GeV, trying to unfold R equals 0.4 even kind of inclusively without some sort of leading track bias is very, very difficult, if not impossible. So you're already kind of getting at a good point, though, which is, of course, if you'd like to see this type of effect, going to larger R is, of course, nice. That is something that we could do in run 3, but in run 2, it's far outside of our kind of statistics.
Is it then an expected bias that what you do find is like one of the subjects of a larger jet that, like the harder one that ended up surviving, like?
Right. So this question, I'm going to rephrase your question to be one of kind of survival bias.
Yeah.
And I will get to it in 2 slides. Okay. You're exactly on point, right? This is exactly the right question to ask, right? If you have an inclusive population, what are you actually selecting? Yeah. So bear with me. If I haven't satisfied your question in a few slides, ask again. So I'm going to go back to the soft drop case for just a moment then. Right, at least we have the kind of the full spectrum over the measured KT range we have accessible, and right, just to say very clearly, what this is telling us is that at a high level, we're not seeing this kind of naive picture of just enhancement at high KT. Right, we instead see this kind of narrowing effect, which we can interpret at least as suggesting that we're kind of not resolving these quasi-particles, this scattering center. But we know from, for example, from our lattice projections, right, we should expect some sort of complicated bound structure. Again, not necessarily specifying what that looks like, but we do have some expectation that this should be somewhere in our medium. So what's the problem? Have we not probed the right kinematics, right? Is it that this observable is not sensitive, right? There's kind of different questions you can ask. How can we actually kind of reconcile these pictures? And one way to do this is to think about using model calculations, right? And so hiding in the background here, right, we have a number of different calculations from hybrid model, from Jetscape, and from Joule. And what we see here is they all kind of have the broad trend, but there's at least within our uncertainties some hint that we can start to try and differentiate between our different models. So of particular note, for example, for this comparison, right, this red is the hybrid model where they've explicitly kind of accounted for and turned on these Moliere scattering effects, right? And we see that it kind of overshoots our yield, right? Whereas if I have this teal, right, this seems at least more consistent with our data and is not including these kind of Moliere contributions. However, right, so this seems kind of promising. However, if I look, for example, at Jetscape, Jetscape is teal, hybrid without Moliere is purple. So hybrid without Moliere and Jetscape are fairly consistent with each other, except Jetscape has contributions from Moliere scattering. So we have these two models that kind of systematically disagree with each other, right? So it opens a question then kind of what is the essential physics that's actually necessary to describe this observable and describe other observables? And to think about these kind of questions, I will come back to this in maybe about 10 slides, but this is something you should keep in mind. However, I wanted to highlight there's a pretty recent new theory paper trying to interpret these results that I thought was actually quite interesting. So it's called this shell model from Sa Wang and collaborators. Unfortunately, I haven't actually gotten to speak with the authors yet, but they seem to be doing quite some work in looking into jet substructure, both in the inclusive and gamma tag cases, with this new, what they call the shell model, which has kind of the usual Pithier hard scattering, some higher twist implementation of energy loss, and then CL Visc for kind of soft sector. So it has many, at least, kind of familiar components that you'd expect from many of these energy loss models. Going into kind of deep details, I'm still trying to disentangle exactly how they vary from others, but my read on it, at least, is that this is in the same way as many of these other energy loss models have some kind of small variations that the authors are particularly interested in, but at least have this kind of higher twist baseline. So there's a lot to compare to, but I'll just focus in here. So they've plotted the soft drop and dynamic grooming here in the same figure. And they do fairly well in describing both of the ratios. Spectra as well, which I don't show here, but is of note because that's not necessarily always the case for other models. Of particular note, though, in comparison, in contrast to some of the models that I just showed you, this is really saying that their expectations are that there's really no difference between the grooming methods at all, at least within their uncertainties, which has to do with how they set their particular parameters of their model. So they're at least saying, I would say the high level picture is similar, but some of the details seem to vary a little bit. The reason though why I want to highlight this is they did, I think, a very nice study where they tried to isolate the impacts of this selection bias. And so I showed you just a selection of the comparisons here. So this top figure, right, this top color, this green, right, corresponds to when they just do the analysis as we would experimentally. So they take an inclusive sample, they measure what they find in their 6880 GeV range, and this should approximately kind of correspond with what we see here. However, they did a second analysis, which is shown here in blue. They call their jet by jet analysis, where they've tagged what their incoming and outgoing jet is, and they basically, you have your initial state, you run it through your model, and now I can directly associate what jet I had initially and what I had in my final state after my set of interactions, right? So this means in practice, right, I've taken care of my selection bias. I know exactly what jets I should be including in my analysis. And here we see, in fact, in this blue, we see a stronger narrowing. So to put very clear labels on it, right, this curve kind of corresponds to what we measured in the inclusive case. This curve corresponds to the no bias case, right? I've taken out the surface bias. And so we see then, right, quite a substantial difference in the curve here, but it's going in an interesting direction. So how we can actually think about this, right? So in the case of, for example, the RG, right, we just see an overall narrowing effect due to this kind of selection bias. But here we have kind of two sets of competing effects, right? KT goes as depends basically on your Z and your theta, right? Or alternatively, the way we define it here, the PT of your subleading subjet and the angle between them. And so in the inclusive case where we include our selection bias, right? What happens is we see that RG narrows, same as our kind of other experimental measurements. However, there's a further selection bias on what PT subleading we find, at least according to this kind of model calculation. So the distribution of the PT sublead looks very similar in PP and lead-lead. Now, in the case I do this without my selection bias, so doing this jet by jet matching, what happens is that RG broadens, right? So the expected effect, right? I actually see some broadening kind of at large angles, but my PT subleading is quenched substantially more. And in fact, this quenching overtakes this RG broadening, which is why it ends up causing, basically without selection bias, it actually becomes more suppressed, right? So talking about narrowing here actually maybe is not the best way to think about it, but rather just in terms of kind of direct suppression. So that you have these kind of two competing effects. So in practice, what this means is that actually selection bias, at least again, in their particular model, reduces the suppression and when comparing it with the experimental measurements. Yeah.
Did they look at RG?
Yeah, they did.
And it shows that it goes up.
Yeah, I haven't.
Interesting. I mean, that's
it's super interesting. Yeah.
Because I mean, exactly as you explained, you'd expect, yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So I want to caveat this with a little bit, which this model, to my knowledge, has been compared to a few substructure measurements, but it has not been systematically compared in the same way as some of the other models that I've shown. So I think this is very interesting, but I think it remains to be, one needs to do kind of a more systematic comparison to see whether this is a model dependent or a model independent statement. But if it is, I think it's quite interesting. So, okay, so this kind of tells us maybe KT, right, even if I had some effect of Moliere scattering here, right, the hope of kind of this naive approach maybe is too naive, right? So how can we go about trying to kind of recover this yield? Well, CMS has already tried to do this in the RG case, right, by looking at gamma tags. So I use my gamma tag as my initial kind of constraint on my hard scattering. There's some distribution on this, so it's not, let's say, exactly 1-to-1, but at least gives me some opportunity to kind of select on something proportional to my initial energy. And so what they've done here is they've measured RG. So I tag my gamma, I look at my recoil jet, and I find my soft drop RG. And I've done this they do this for two cases. So one on the right is the less quenched, right? And you see this is kind of approximating your inclusive sample, right? And you see this kind of narrowing effect that we've already talked about. But then in the case that I open up my selection on my jet PT, right, is expanding your XJ gamma, you see now I'm starting to recover my yield and enhancing kind of back up to approximately flat, let's say. So now, one I think still needs to think very carefully about what this can tell us. They have a number of kind of model comparisons. So I mean, okay, let me back up. Experimentally, this is excellent because it tells us that we're getting an opportunity to start to recover this kind of more quenched sample that we're losing the inclusive case. So we're reducing the impact of our surface box. It's telling us that this kind of gamma tag technique works quite nicely. However, I think we need to think a little bit more still about what this can tell us. Again, this question of what can kind of the models actually extract and what can we learn from it, right? Because I've compared the same set of hybrid model calculations and the details don't matter so much, except to highlight that these kind of this blue, for example, includes Moliere scattering, and this purple, for example, doesn't. So you see, okay, this works quite nicely in kind of this broader quenching case. However, if I look at my less quenched case, it's less consistent with our data. So it turns out that taking kind of a consistent parameter set over the entire phase space of measurements, you really cannot do this, at least for the hybrid model. Now, the hybrid model is, of course, only one particular model, but I think it indicates that, it's not clear that we're kind of able to actually describe all of this data yet. So it's very useful in making these constraints, but we need to, continue to kind of work on how we understand these. So I did want to come back to this for a moment, though, because, in fact, Sa Wang and collaborators exactly suggested, right, trying to look at RG, they've done comparisons to the CMS, but then they also have done some comparisons that are closer to at least kinematics. And they've done kind of a nice study in this case of varying the impact of the z-cut for my soft arc-gluoned RG for a gamma tagged selection, right? And precisely to Laura's point, this approach they predict will actually show us potentially quite a strong enhancement. Of particular note, right, is you see, you see that this, right, these kind of largest enhancements though are coming from kind of your lower ZG cuts, or sorry, your lower Z cut on your soft drop. So, okay, we'll have to see how we can optimize this. But I think this is a really promising approach. And in fact, right, this is not new. Sorry, the citation got cut off, but right, there's this kind of deep learning study trying to identify these from 5 or 6 years ago, right? And exactly this point of if we can kind of select on our initial energy, right, which our gamma gives the opportunity to, right, we really should expect to see some enhancement here. This was a study kind of on the hybrid model. So the point is, right, this I think is a really interesting direction we can go. And all of this is very intriguing. We don't have kind of a complete picture from run 2 from, for example, the CMS measurement, right? There's only 4 bins in that measurement, but this is an excellent place for at least to look in run 3, right? We have tremendous statistics, right? We have, photon jet measurements are really within our capabilities now. And I think this is an excellent place for us to be able to measure some very interesting kinematics.
Sorry, on the right
Yeah.
plot there, what's the difference between the red, blue, and the gray?
They're varying the Z cut on soft drop. So
Okay, it's still the Z cut.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, they're saying that I guess that it really doesn't depend so much in the ratio, but it just depends in the overall kind of distribution, how much narrowing or broadening you see there. Experimentally, right, trying to go below 0.2 is tricky. We'll see, maybe the time reclustering can do better on this.
Maybe
Sorry.
higher jet PT maybe.
Right, higher jet PT, right? There are kinematic directions we can go, I think, to make this more or less accessible. And with run 3, we have the statistics to actually do this in a way that run 2 is just really out of the question. So I think there's a lot that Elise can say on this. I'm looking forward to what we can do with it. So I wanted to step back for just a moment then and kind of reflect on kind of broader questions, at least from my perspective, kind of what are the essential questions for run 3 and beyond, right? In my perspective, right, number 1 is really trying to actually elucidate kind of this microscopic structure of the QGP, right? We have some hints, some indications for things like color coherence. We have not seen this quasi-particle scattering, although I think we have very good reason to think that it's there, right? We haven't seen the dead cone directly in lead or in AA generically, right? So can we actually elucidate where these properties lie? I think this is really a key for our run 3 data and going forward. I think we should really try and focus in on revealing the space-time structure of our showers, right? So the pictures that I've shown you, right, are all kind of these momentum space showers that don't have a clear time dependence, right? No one really has a clear picture of kind of what our space-time structure of these showers look like, right? This isn't really an issue in PP, but since we have our timescales in with our medium, right, this is really a critical question. So can we actually constrain what these showers look like, and then elucidating what the medium's response to our jets are? I think all 3 of these questions are really keys to nailing down our understanding of QGP, at least from the perspective of jets. And so I at least put my wish list here, what I would love we could do. I think we're at the point where measuring really a full Loon plane is within our capabilities. It's going to be difficult, but I think we have the statistics, and I think we're developing the techniques to be able to do this. Energy correlators are certainly going to play a role in this. We even have been doing some work. Fortunately, I don't have time not quite far enough along to show this today, but looking at entropy correlations between dye jets and trying to use this to extract kind of the correlation between dye jets and how much information they share, for example. So there's really a huge space to be able to work with this. And then using these boson tags, these gamma tags, okay, less for Elise Z tagged, but CMS has already shown some very promising results from this from run 2. and fully exploiting kind of these heavy flavor tags. So we have we have a number of novel background techniques to be able to kind of enable this. I think as a broader statement, these kind of AI ML techniques can be very useful if they're applied carefully, right? As we all know, the kind of just direct Monte Carlo training is problematic, and we need to think very carefully about where these can apply. But I think they can if we're careful in this regard, and then taking full advantage of kind of our new let's say new dimensions, right? We have our OO data, which, for example, is a very short sample, but something kind of comparable to the statistics of our 2.76 TeV led from run one, but our background's smaller, right? So this means that actually in practice, kind of we have more accessible statistics. We now have these experimental techniques that we've developed over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think there's a lot that we can do that on that once we really set our minds to doing this. So this is just my opinionated take, but I think all of these things are things that we can get to in run 3. And I think it's time to actually do this. The quality of our run 3 data has been mixed, let's say, up to this point, but we now really have some high quality data sets. The issues that have persisted are kind of either resolved now or resolved in just the next couple of months. And I think we're in an excellent position to be able to take advantage of this and really put a distinct, at least impact on all of these questions. So I'm gonna wrap up kind of my experimental take here by asking kind of a broad question. So I show a couple of measurements here. I hope these are familiar, but I want to come back to this question of how can we actually learn from this, right? The picture from our model calculations, I would say at best is unclear. Some work well in some calculations, some work well in others. How do we actually, kind of do this in a systematic way? And it's of course actually, right, this is a small picture, but it's actually much worse than this. So I think some of you maybe seen this before. I updated it just for this talk. And I used to be able to fit everything in this picture, and now I can't, I gave up. There's too many measurements, right? And this represents kind of the wealth, the legacy, let's say, of Rick and LHC, high momentum transfer measurements so far, right? There's a huge amount of data here. Some probably is degenerate, right? Some kind of overlaps with each other, but there's a huge phase space. So how do we take advantage of this? And if you've seen any of my talks in the last 10 years, my answer is going to be Bayesian inference. Right. So fundamentally, this question is, given a particular model, right? I want to ask the questions of what parameters of that model are most compatible with my experimental data. Right? I think this is really the way to frame kind of everything you can learn from this. And so, right, we have the answer to this, right, is using Bayes' theorem, right? We have just 3 terms we need to focus on, right? We have our prior in red, right? All this is doing is making explicit what my assumptions are about what my model parameters could be, right? I have my likelihood in blue here, right, which is just some overall function to describe how well my data is described by my model at some set of parameters. And this folds in kind of all kinds of details. For example, your correlations between your uncertainties, your data uncertainties, your theory uncertainties, all these different pieces can kind of be combined in this term. And you put this together and run a computing for quite some time, and you get this posterior distribution, right, which really, the most probable value of this gives you kind of your best description of your data for your model. And in principle, kind of encodes everything that you might want to learn about the compatibility of that model with that data. Right, it kind of encodes everything and lets you ask a number of questions, which, things about consistency of the data in the model, how consistent is the model itself, how can I constrain, how best can I kind of constrain this model with new measurements, all kinds of questions like this. So I'm going to give my very short version of this today for the sake of time. But there's 3, there's 3 things you should always ask when you look at Bayesian inference. So you have to ask questions about the analysis, but you should also ask about the model and the data. What am I actually including, right? And all of these choices are very important. They can change how you think about the underlying or the kind of the final results. So I will skip over much of this. You all can look at it and we can talk about it more. But the kind of bottom line here is the first results I'll show you is using this Jetscape matter plus LBT, trying to extract Q hat, right? So this Q hat, right, is a transport coefficient that's telling you effectively how does my particle interact with medium, how much transverse momentum do I pick up as I interact and propagate through it. And we focus first on just inclusive hadrons and jets, dealing with all kinds of details about uncertainties. All of these choices are important. Right, so we can just really summarize it as these 2 points. We want to focus on the transport coefficients, and there's a lot of computing and details that hides behind kind of everything I've said here. Please ask, we can talk about it, but we don't need to focus on it today unless there's interest. So in practice, what this looks like is I run my model calculations at some set of parameters. I do my Bayesian inference analysis, and I go from some kind of spread of model predictions to some constrained posterior distribution. This is, of course, only a small subset of the data that we did this on. For a hadron and jet, we did this for 729 data points. You can see the whole thing there, and you can squint at this for days. There's lots there, but if you'll trust me, the overall point is we have an overall kind of reasonable agreement, but there's some tension for particular measurements. So we decided to take this then and kind of look in some more detail at what this Q hat does for different selections of our data. And we see, if we do this for jets only and for hadrons only, for example, we start to see this separation in Q hat. And this is definitely surprising, right? Because it's telling you that what's supposed to be a fundamental parameter of the medium, right? This transport coefficient may depend on the probe that you look at, right? This is really not what you would anticipate. And so we did some kind of differential studies to look into this in detail. And what it turns out is that it really is all about, fundamentally, it's about kind of uncontrolled theory uncertainties, which is to say, if I look at my hadron data, my most precise data are my hadrons at lowest PT, right? I have the best statistics there, my systematics are small. And this gives very strong constraints. Bayesian inference takes these uncertainties seriously, right? But in that region is where my model is kind of most uncertain, right? How I model hadrons at 5 GeV, very much an open question. And so if I repeat this analysis, instead including all my data, for example, only calibrating above 30 GeV for my hadrons, I see that in this kind of higher PT range, I get a much better description of my data. And so we did this kind of as a systematic scan, which is shown here on the left. And the point is, basically, if I take just my jet data and my high PT hadrons, everything's consistent. It's all fine. It's just these low PT hadrons. And so this is really pointing to kind of a shortcoming in our broader ability to kind of model in the field. There are constraints about these model choices we've had to make, and we need to think about a systematic way to include our uncertainties on the models as well in these calibrations. We have the mechanism to do it, but how to do this really from a theory perspective needs to be better understood. So, okay, with my 10 minutes-ish left.
As you're moving on
Yep.
that one. So, or is it that at 5 GeV, a lot of it's not jet per track? I mean, I know Jetscape has a bulk background in it, but
Right.
I mean, you're trying to fit Q hat to a region where a large fraction of the particles are not actually anything to do with a jet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you have a ton of 5 GeV hadrons though, or that are really coming from your background. I mean, right? It shouldn't be. I mean, I don't know if I want to pick exactly a cutoff there, but 5 GeV I think is reasonably hard, even at LHC. It's semi hard maybe.
But if it's 50-50, you're still trying to fit something to a region that's not maybe Q hat dominated.
Sure. I mean, but this is working with a calibrated soft sector, right? So at least kind of in the bulk, we know that this does reasonably well. So I mean, but I would argue the question that you're asking is I think kind of the point I was trying to make. Maybe I wasn't quite clear enough about it, but what 5 GeV looks like, how well we can model that, I think is quite uncertain. As you say, maybe it's the bulk contributions are larger, maybe it's 50-50, maybe it's some other distribution. I really don't know. But the point is, there's really just no approach for adding a model uncertainty for that statement. So I know somehow that we don't know what this looks like, but is it a 10% effect? Is it a 50% effect?
Yeah, I agree with that.
No one can kind of say, I think, at this point. But I think you're exactly right. I mean, should we have cut off at 6 GeV or 8 GeV or 10 GeV? I think you could ask quite viably. So for us, we did this scan because we didn't necessarily want to pick a preferential value. The particular downside of going to high PT is that we lose pretty much all the RIC data at this point, right? So even as it stands, the RIC data, the uncertainties are large enough, it's just not so constrained, unfortunately. And so it's a balance of these things. Usually, I would say it's the experimentalists want to push down to see what happens, and the theorists try and stop us from doing that. So it's the right question. I think we need to kind of figure out how best to handle this. And I mean, even if we somehow think of a way to do this, right? This is still leading over a Q hat. This is leading over matrix elements that are hard scattering, right? There are so many different directions one can go to systematically improve this. And the size of these corrections aren't small. So even if I somehow kind of tune my soft sector to do a little bit better on this, am I just kind of compensating for the fact that I need to go to NLO Q hat to better describe this, or these kind of things? I think it's kind of all an open question.
Right, yes, I agree with everything you said. I guess I see that more as like, we don't know how to model it. I guess it is an uncertainty in the modeling, but it might be just that you're tuning it to the wrong place. I guess it's just a way to interpret what you said of like,
right. I mean,
is it that we don't know how to quench a jet, or is it just that the whole modeling of our event has some uncertainty in it?
Right. Like, I mean, take the limit of I've perfectly calibrated my soft sector. If I've done that, right, then I should be able to kind of get this fraction right if I can get my hard sector right. But I don't know what my hard sector should look like there, so I have some uncertainty in the choice of my coupling for this or what have you. Now, our soft sector also isn't perfect, so that's another thing to consider, right? But I think all these things kind of compound. So I think it's a function of judiciously choosing what we can focus on and what we can prove, and trying to make those choices. I think is not necessarily obvious. I mean, even in my kind of discussions with theorists, it's not that they say we need to do this exact thing next.
Because it looks like you're making a dramatic change in Q hat over T cubed, right? Between including everything and not. But how much does it actually change your data? Like if you take the jet and compare the hadron, if you sort of.
This is hadrons above 30 GeV. It's pretty much the same as jets. Okay, within reason, let's say. It does quite well here. It looks by eye. This looks okay, right? This is often what kind of when folks are doing kind of initial calibrations for theory, right? I think folks look at this and say, we're not far off. The point though is that Bayesian inference is taking the size of these uncertainties seriously and saying, if you miss those, the whole game's off. Like you haven't described the data. And so I guess we're using a physicist-inspired intuition to say, what region of data we're kind of focused on to look into this. But this miss is actually quite bad, and that's why when we take that seriously, it misses kind of systematically at IPT. So right. So this study now I think we've shown at a few conferences, and so I want to kind of ask the next question of how do we kind of advance the state of the art from kind of this place? We've done this calibration, we used our jets and hadrons, we get a reasonably consistent picture, but some details need to be understood. And so there are three things that I was going to try and focus on. We'll see how the time looks as we go. But so the first thing I want to focus on is something very particular for experimentalists, right? Which is uncertainty correlations and how we're reporting. Right? So the bottom line here, right, is I have these three different kind of sketches for how my uncertainties are correlated for, let's say, some pseudo data versus some theory. And right, between these three, if I do a calibration, I will get dramatically different answers for fully correlated versus uncorrelated, for example. And there's in fact a very nice study that's looked at this. They just looked at Atlas jet RA with some simplified jet energy loss model. The details don't really matter. All I want you to focus on basically is on the upper right, we have fully correlated uncertainties, and the bottom left, we have uncorrelated uncertainties. And okay, we can even just look at the distribution of the diagonal. Some are fairly consistent, some are dramatically different. So the point is, if I want to actually make a statement about what about what my model is consistent with, I need to understand what my experimental uncertainties look like in detail. Okay, and so we have some techniques within kind of the Bayesian world to try and estimate these things, but they're solely estimates. And so really the next step, the thing that we should be doing is be reporting our systematic uncertainties, the sources of them individually. So we have, within the hard sector, there are 4 analyses that I'm aware of that actually do this, 3 from Elise and 1 from CMS. And right, we can look at their HEP data. I will highlight a little bit more particularly what I mean, right? So in this case, okay, this is from the KT measurement, right? I've broken out you have the statistical uncertainty, but also, for example, the signed tracking efficiency. So I don't even need to do a full covariance matrix. I just need to know how the sign changes going point by point, and I can kind of build a covariance matrix on top of that. You can try and break out the sources. Some of them we don't necessarily know how to deal with in kind of a side manner. It's okay too. We can combine those together. We can still use our estimation approaches to do this. But any information that we can report on this really makes a big difference. CMS really has gone all out in this gamma tagged substructure measurement. In fact, they've reported every single source. They reported full covariance matrices for their statistics, as well as for their Monte Carlo. Outstanding. It does take a little bit more work, but it's really, in the grand scheme of overall analyses, not that much work to get at least some of these smaller sources broken out, and makes a huge difference for Bayesian inference. So the likelihood of people going back to older analyses and updating these is not very high. But if we really want to get serious about trying to understand the quark-gluon plasma in detail, this is something we should be doing now. It's not so bad. We can talk about it by email or wherever else today, but this is something I really would encourage everyone to be doing. You can always do better. You can try and think about cross-experiment uncertainties, all kinds of things. Better is great, but if we can just get the baseline, it will make a big impact. With the one caveat of please report them in machine readable ways. If you just write, I have a 3% global uncertainty in my header, it means we just have to go through by hand and extract these. It makes life much worse. So please try and put them in the table in a way that can be read. So this means your measurements will have a bigger impact. When we look at this on, for example, the substructure side, we're interested in substructure because systematically, right, these are substructure measurements. They give us a test bench to actually be able to do these in more detail. So I'm running out of time here. So maybe just to say a little bit about computing, because this has some broad applicability even beyond heavy ions, right? To do a kind of a full calibration, soft sector, hard sector, concurrent evolution of my medium and my jet, all these great things, we're talking about hundreds of millions of core hours for a single model, which is, no one's going to give that to us. So we need to use AI ML tools to make this even kind of marginally tractable. So the tool of kind of preference in heavy ions for these Bayesian inferences, these so-called Gaussian process emulators, where the idea is I basically define some training points where I run my model at kind of high precision. I can then train this Gaussian process, which is this non-parametric interpolation. We don't need to worry too much about the details, but the point is, what's important is that it gives us both the central value, right, this black, but also these bands represent an uncertainty. So as I kind of move away from my points, I have a sense of how uncertain I am, of how well do I actually know my model outputs. And so by doing this, I can run at some smaller subset of my points, still expensive, but manageable, train my Gaussian process to then predict my model everywhere. Now, even that though, right, still gets us into the 10 million for a simplified study. So how can we do better? And there's a few things that we tried doing, one being active learning. So I run my simulation at some set of model parameters over kind of my full space. That's this blue curve. And then I look systematically, where am I most uncertain, and place my points preferentially for my next model runs to try and reduce those uncertainties. So just techniques like this, right? This is kind of common sense for how do I focus on reducing my uncertainties can actually make a big impact on how well you're able to actually propagate kind of your uncertainties and have precise model predictions. I'll say just something very briefly about this. This is a new project that we're hoping to post in the archive quite soon. But another way you can think about this, right? We run Monte Carlo simulations, right? These have some statistical measure, right? I can run, if I run 1,000,000 points, I'm much more certain than if I run 1,000, right? And I have some uncertainty that I can extrapolate from from, kind of how many events, for example, I've run. And so we can ask a question, can I very carefully put my points in my parameter space and run at different precision? So instead of running everything to, full precision, can I run something a little bit less and still get the same information out? And so kind of the concept is, right, you can imagine for some model parameter X, right, kind of the naive approach could be I run one very high precision point, one high precision point, right, and then lower as I move across the space. But actually, if you do this a little bit more carefully, for example, you optimize, you want to put low precision and high precision points closely together, you use a Gaussian process that's aware of kind of what these uncertainties are, you put these pieces together, and you get this variable precision Gaussian process, which we've developed with collaborators at Duke. And the bottom line, I'll just say something on the left for the sake of time, is that if I compare kind of the traditional approach in purple versus this new approach in orange, we see substantially better descriptions of our model data at fixed budget. So what that means is that I can run less computing and cover the overall space, which means that, for example, I can then use that other computing to run more models, or I can use it to increase the sophistication of my model, all kinds of benefits from this. So the kind of the bottom line takeaway from this is that having more information about your overall space of your model is more important than having just a few high precision points. We also use this to run some sensitivity studies, but I just don't have time to talk about that, so I will skip that for there. I want to say one last thing here in my final moments. So we've also done a look looking at some substructure in kind of a simplified way. We presented this now a couple of years ago. We just included a few measurements at the time. And there's a few caveats to kind of what you see here, but basically we see that we get stronger constraints if we include substructure. We've included more kind of additional or potentially orthogonal information compared to just a jet RAA. We have to reconcile that kind of with our initial jet and hadron calibration. And so you could reasonably ask, where's the update on this? It's a very good question. And the point is, right, we want to do this in a careful way, and we want to actually calibrate with kind of the full set of substructure. And things have changed a lot, right? So this top part is what it looked like at the time. This bottom is now just published, unfolded, inclusive jet substructure measurements. We may even be missing one or two, but this is kind of the broad point, right? We've had a huge influx of information that we now need to kind of systematically propagate our model through and do our analysis on. And it turns out that this actually is an even bigger question than maybe it initially seems. So let's take our inclusive jet RAA and just think about what we need, right? We have measurements from 4 different experiments. They all have their own kinematics selections. And I can, for example, define this in some set of configuration files. This is some example, right? But the point is I have a huge set of phase space here, many points per measurement. And this is just for inclusive jet RAA. It gets more, right? So this is a list of as far as we know, all hard sector observables measured at RIC and LHC, right? We can try and organize these in a particular manner. So we've chosen some kind of organizing scheme to try and get this sorted. And we are in the process of curating all these, where curation means really understanding fully how the analysis is done, reading all the papers, implementing all the parameters, putting in our own implementation, comparing to the model to make sure it's at least not kind of nonsense. There are some constraints on kind of what you can do there. But bottom line, we're working with 92 observables, at least 65 papers, which is a just huge effort. So this is a work in progress still, but the hope here is that this can kind of become a community resource. If I want to compare my model, we can do this kind of in a systematic way. It enables Bayesian inference across different models. I'll pause here to say briefly, as kind of a result of this effort, we're now working with folks on a Bayesian inference of the hybrid model, right? To try and compare kind of in a systematic way to this Jetscape plus LBT, right? So if you want to make broad statements about what the QGP actually looks like, doing this with more models is just kind of essential. So that brings me to a close here. I think these two pieces, these experimental measurements and how you interpret them are really two key pieces in how they interact, right? They're really in kind of conversation. As we work through these things, we learn more, that gives us new ideas for how to make these measurements. But yeah, they're both kind of essential pieces to actually trying to answer this question of what does the microscopic structure look like. I think we're not quite there yet, but you know, we're getting some glimpses. But I think particularly with this run-3 data, it's going to be a very interesting time. I will close with my last slide to just highlight the evolution of expansion. I was doing a little bit of looking back on my time here in the group doing my PhD, and as it evolved with our physics knowledge. And you know, we both have this, I think, this very nice evolution and expansion with time. And it's you know, with that, it's a pleasure to be back here. Thanks.
Such a baby in 215.
I had hair.
Why don't we do fancy day anymore?
That's a
Bring that
wonderful
back.
question. I couldn't find the picture with everyone. I could only find the one with me and a few people, but yeah, it must be somewhere, but
We can bring it back.
That could be my.
For your defense?
Yeah, it could be my defense
That's where it
request.
started.
How often is fancy day?
Like,
It was like once a year.
Okay, that's
or it was like when someone defended or left, and it only was one or two
Not
years.
on my defense. I wanna be the only fancy one.
like if I remember it, the impetus for this was I was in some wedding. I
Yes.
ended up having to buy a navy tuxedo. And what you gonna do with a navy tuxedo after the wedding? So we created Fancy Day to another reason to wear a tuxedo. Exactly.
And like I feel like it was like me and Hannah and Katie had been like in a ton of weddings, and we were like,
exactly.
wear our bridesmaid dresses.
Yeah, it works very well.
And you never wear again. Perfect.
So bring it back.
Yeah, I was around for one fancy day. Never. I think once Hannah and Katie graduated, they were the motivating force behind it.
Yeah, you're right. They did. Yeah, you're right. Katie, Hannah did one. Katie.
So in your last bit, Raymond, you
Yeah.
talk about like it being an awful lot of coding up, like, are you using Rivet?
No, we're not. So we've talked about this on and off for years. Very candidly, Rivet's quite painful to use for a lot of these observables, at least in our experience. Having kind of more flexibility in how we approach these things and how we've kind of managed our data, we've found it to be a lot faster and a lot more effective in kind of how we've done this. So you have problems, I mean, of things like, so the observable itself is maybe not so bad. I will say that, you know, nominally there is this effort to have kind of all the experiments implement their observables. This is a nice idea. It never really came to fruition. So at least, you know, for most of these observables that kind of be listed here, there's no kind of existing implementation. We're starting from scratch one way or the other. But what we also found was things like how you manage background subtraction tends to be very model dependent. And that's kind of part of where these kind of pain points start to come in. So for example, just getting to support hybrid model and kind of this initial approach that we were using, Jetscape, started requiring a lot of gymnastics to kind of select the right set of particles and implement the background subtraction. And then it depends you know, a priori, it's not necessarily obvious how best to subtract for some of these observables. So we have some variation of methods that's observable by observable. You know, there's, you know, some standardization using this negative energy recombiner for substructure observables seems to work pretty well, but you know, at least for ones that are either groomed or kind of more additive, but it doesn't necessarily work so well for others. It's one of those things that seemed like it would be very natural, but in the exercise of kind of trying to do it, we've found that it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
go
not
so well.
necessarily selling Rivet. It just seems like the community keeps reinventing this
Yeah, I mean, I agree.
part of like how to do it, and maybe this way is better. I'm like I say, I don't have any stakes anywhere. It's just
I would say
that it all gets redone every single time we start. Is how to do a model into an analysis.
right.
Even it is a huge amount, right?
Right. I mean, so the one argument I'll make on this, I mean, really it's a function of, you know, there's only a few of us doing this, so we tried Rivet and it was a pain and we decided to kind of go our own way and it's worked okay. The fact that we were able to, I mean, as much as it was a pain to kind of route the hybrid backgrounds and what have you, we were able to go from kind of nothing to a working prototype for pretty much all the observables in a couple weeks. So, and I think that was because we hadn't added a model before. So I think that at least argues to, I don't know of any other models that are kind of sharing their implementations, at least in terms of kind of these observable things. And so this is not, it's not that this has to be the answer, but it's just, this has worked well for us, so this is what we decided to kind of proceed with. It's already on this we've been working on this for a good fraction of a year though. So yeah, I guess we're kind of disinclined to kind of change at this point.
I guess spinning it the other way, like, is it usable by anyone else? Because this whole, what exactly does a collaboration do is an age-old question, and we try our best and not knocking any collaboration to write in our papers what we do.
Right.
And it's amazing what's not written in our papers about what we do.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
No, it's sort of, when you come and try to do it not knowing, it's like, whoa, how did you forget to write that?
Even if you try to read what you did, you go back and you read, how did that plot not ever go? Yeah, it's very hard to get all the details.
Exactly, and this is actually, I would say, something where Jetscape is kind of nicely positioned to do this, because we have people from Elise, Atlas, CMS, Star, S Phoenix. And so we can kind of, if you have a problem, if something doesn't work, you just have a small conversation as opposed to having to have, set up a whole whatever. And so at this moment, like, I think I linked the GitHub repository. You could try, but it's not really necessarily set up for others to use at this moment. But I think the goal is to come to a point where basically, if you have a set of final state hadrons, you tell the software where it is and tell it what observables you want to look at, and it just kind of can go.
Right.
So we're not quite there yet.
Cool. I guess you're not. Yeah, and of course you get to do your bit first. It's just
Sure.
It would be neat for all these other model people to come out and they say, well, can you do this? And normally the argument is, oh, but I don't really know what they did. And can you tell it? And it was like, this is what we did. So.
Right. So I mean, this keep going back to this hybrid example, but like, it really was, this was part of kind of what made this possible, was that we could kind of, let's say you could make a separation of concerns, right? They, give us their model that they're excited about, with whatever features they want, they can run it and they can pass this off, the final state hadrons, and we can kind of take it from there.
Right.
And a little sensitive about who does what and, whatever, as I'm sure you can imagine. But the point is that I think it really sets us up to actually do a multi-model Bayesian calibration, which no one's managed to do before in,
Cool.
N years. So I would fully agree it's not perfect, but I've been trying to focus with this particularly on, kind of not having the perfect be the enemy of the good, and just trying to find something that will work. Maybe in 5 years time it makes sense to convert all this to Rivet. Sure, I don't know, but
I guess you just said it. You this Bayesian part you could take apart from Jetscape, as I think of Jetscape as a whole, of having to run the whole
yeah
from initial state onwards. I can just give you final state.
Exactly.
Some format, I guess, step format, and then you could do this bit.
Right, exactly. There's Jetscape, the model, the framework, whatever, and then Jetscape, the Bayesian stuff. And this is oriented towards the Bayesian stuff.
Cool.
At the end, this spits out files that read into our Bayesian analysis code, and you can kind of, I don't think I would necessarily advocate for folks to just kind of try and run this themselves, because there's lots of, lots of details on how you do this, but in principle you could, right? Like, we had the code picked up by Adam and Danny, and they did this calibration of some OO parameters on this kind of semi-analytical generated loss model that Danny and Yassine worked on some years ago, and they just kind of picked it up, and for a couple of parameters, it was it seemed to work okay.
I have John behind you.
Oh, hi, John.
Hey, Raymond. Hi. So first of all, nice talk, quite comprehensive, and I apologize for not being there. At least we saw each other last month. So it seems, I'm going to take a risk and say this, seems to me that you are taking a bulldozer when you might be able to utilize a backhoe or even a shovel. So let me just say why. Since you also showed something from Katie, and now you know where I'm headed. Why not restrict the initial conditions or the geometry rather than just taking all the data, to better determine the path length, and that would make your calculations more tractable in terms of time and maybe even easier to compare experiments. And then, of course, you get a better determination of path length. So you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, take a specific event shape and put it through the models, where you restrict the path length.
So I think I see your point, but what I'm not sure about is what the impact of kind of fluctuations in jet energy loss and how that kind of factors into this path length dependence. So I guess my concern is that if I do this and I see, for example, some differences in my data, is that going to be driven by kind of too narrow a selection on my path length, or is it kind of driven by physics differences? I guess one could try and kind of derive what this looks like, but I guess the limit of that also is having the full set of distribution. So maybe I'm missing what you're getting at.
No, I think you've got it. I'm just suggesting maybe take two different geometries where you have the trigger, that let's say the gamma going in one direction and the away side being either a large path length or a short path length, depending upon the geometry. And I can't predict what you're going to see or how complicated that is, which is kind of up to you, I guess. But I'm just saying, try to restrict things somewhat in terms of the initial conditions, because seeing some of your slides with all the different possibilities is a little bit overwhelming, at least for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think you make a good point. I would maybe even rephrase what you're suggesting to almost think kind of in the same vein as like Joule with and without recoils, or hybrid model varying their length, their LRes at kind of a few select values, or turning off Moliere scattering, things like this. You can at least set kind of some limiting cases on your behavior to kind of guide, as you say, what direction to try and investigate next, right? Because yeah, as you say, I mean, there are a huge number of possibilities, and we need to find a way to choose carefully how, what we actually spend our time investigating. Speaking as an experimentalist for a moment, right? Theorists can always come up with a new way to match the latest data, but whether that kind of ends up being ad hoc or whether it's really points to kind of what physics is essential, I think we need to figure out. So I think that could be a good way to go about doing it.
Yeah, I agree. And in particular, thinking of using AI in certain ways, maybe you could help it out a little.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, this work on this kind of very precision Gaussian process and things like this. This is okay. It's very different than LLMs, but I think it's a very nice kind of intermediate. I mean, the Gaussian process you can kind of train as a Bayesian neural network, so you can take advantage of some of these kind of new AI ML developments, but still you're able to essentially pull out your uncertainties and things like this. So I really have liked this kind of as a middle approach, as a direction to start, but I think we'll probably have to kind of expand how we're using these tools as we go forward.
Thanks.